Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you guys coming. My name is Andy Pemberton. I work for CloudBees. We're sort of a, show of hands, how many people have heard of CloudBees? That's comforting. Maybe 80% of the room. That's good, 75% of the room. So CloudBees, we're very similar to Red Hat in business model. We are a commercial company backing the Jenkins open source project. So really, 100% of our focus as a company is on DevOps and specifically with Jenkins. So we have a couple of products. I'll talk to you briefly about sort of our product portfolio, but most of what I'm going to talk about today is a really awesome DevOps flow using OpenShift v3 and CloudBees Jenkins Platform, more specifically Jenkins Enterprise. So I appreciate you guys coming out. I thought, hey, a good way to start is to just introduce myself like you would any other conversation, right? I'm going to save a bunch of time, hopefully, for questions. So if you have questions toward the end, feel free. But yeah, just like any conversation, I thought I would introduce myself. So again, my name's Andy. I manage a team of folks at CloudBees called our solution architects and our consulting team. So I work all day in the field with customers. My background actually is in consulting. So I used to work for a mid-market consulting firm called CapTech. That's less interesting than I think a lot of the customers I worked with. I think I was able to work with a bunch of really, really cool companies. That's just a smattering. I worked with a bunch more than that. But spent a lot of time at Comcast working on their Xbox app and their public API platform. So we were doing REST APIs back when microservices were called REST APIs. But we were doing a bunch of really cool stuff that drives a lot of the things you see on TV, right? So when you see Xfinity, I used to work on some of those things. Worked on some other cool platforms, Campbell Soup. Again, these are pretty cool household brands. One story I'll tell you, again, that's just cool kind of connecting your career together. I worked at GE Healthcare. Actually, I was working at a startup company that was building like a hospital mapping thing, like a web app and services to do hospital tracking. And the day my daughter was born, I looked up and saw the very platform I worked on because GE eventually acquired it. So this is kind of a cool story, weaving everything together. But really in all these places that I work, guys, I'm an engineer. I'm a software engineer by trade and by heart. I've been an open source guy for a long time. But in all these places, I've always sort of found myself leaning toward like the frameworky things. Like how can we get the whole development team to be better? And it always, you kind of lend yourself to, hey, I'm actually going to help fix the builds or I'm going to automate this, and so that's really, what I've done at almost all the places you see up there. And actually in almost every case, some slant of open source stuff I was doing at all these places. But from there, one of the customers I spent a lot of time with was Capital One. So Capital One, if you don't know, they're now the nation's fourth or fifth biggest bank. I think they're the fourth biggest credit card company. They're the fourth or fifth biggest bank, depending on how you count, which is kind of crazy. They were founded in my hometown. Actually, I'm from Richmond, Virginia. It's actually where Capital One was founded. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. U of R grad. Cool. Yeah, so I actually decided to get off the road, stop the consulting for a while, took a job at Capital One, and actually I was the DevOps guy. When I first started, I did DevOps for their mobile apps and mobile APIs. So same kind of thing, REST APIs, Java heavy shop. But that was a really cool experience, and it really got me into using Jenkins more day to day. And also looking at this problem of automation and DevOps from sort of like a whole team perspective. How do we get the whole team to be good at this, right? One of the tools I was using a lot was Jenkins, and actually, it's kind of cool to say I was one of the first, I think it was the very first employee of Capital One to commit to open source as an employee. I know that because I helped write the legal process to do it with some attorney guys. It was all very weird to me because the alternative was just using my personal laptop in the evenings. But I made it so Cap One people could commit to open source. And when I did that, actually, the open source project I committed to used CloudBees. They used CloudBees Jenkins. Interestingly, for those that know the Jenkins Hudson history, it was actually an Oracle managed project, which makes that even funnier for those of you who might know that history. But yeah, so that was my first introduction to CloudBees, and I really sort of checked the company out, and that's what I do now. So I had the luxury of working on a lot of really cool things. I'm honored to work with the caliber of customers we get to work with. People use Jenkins really all over the world, and the smartest shops use Jenkins. It's just really cool to me. I was at DockerCon last week. Docker uses Jenkins to build Docker core. Red Hat teams use Jenkins all over the place, but Netflix and just all these very cool companies, and they publicly write about it, right? They talk about their use of Jenkins and how they automate their dev flow. One of the things I've really latched onto in my job, aside from the day-to-day working with customers, I've sort of latched onto this effort we kicked off called Jenkins Pipeline. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about Pipeline today. Show of hands, who has used the feature set called Jenkins Pipeline in the past? Okay, 2. Well, good. So I have some very intro stuff for those who have not, but maybe I can either field questions or hopefully cover some more advanced stuff too. And yeah, I'm A. Pemberton on pretty much everything. You can find me, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you want. How about OpenShift? Are there a lot of OpenShift users in the room? V3? You guys are all running OpenShift V3 or V2? 3? Okay. So cool. I have this is a Red Hat show, right? So I didn't do like a huge, elaborate overview of OpenShift. I assume that, folks mostly know about it. But I'm glad I did because it seems like there aren't as many users in the room. OpenShift is Red Hat's PaaS. I mean, it's the simple way to say it. It's a platform as a service by Red Hat. It is a lightweight layer on top of really Kubernetes and Docker. So I really like that. Again, in terms of software elegance, I actually think it's a really elegant stack to learn. You can go read about Kubernetes, and then you can go read about OpenShift and get it. I'll give a really brief overview. Red Hat has really good pictures of it, right? So you can go out and check on the OpenShift site. They have great architecture documentation. It explains how the whole thing works. But at a high level, what does a PaaS really do? Well, a platform as a service I look at as almost a rapid application platform. It helps you, I think they have a nice tagline somewhere. It's essentially, host, run, and scale your applications. Develop, host, and scale your applications on OpenShift, which I think is an easy way to say it. So if you look at dev and ops, right? Look at me, a pipeline, right? If you look at dev and ops, I really think of a PaaS as sort of like folding that together so that dev and ops are closer together. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So the experience of the developer and how they actually first author their applications can actually more quickly impact production. OpenShift has a very well thought out command line interface for how you sort of interact with it from a developer flow perspective. And if you have the right permissions, you can actually take your app all the way through to production. And that's a hallmark PaaS kind of capability. That's what platforms as a service are really there for, right? I look at all the PaaS solutions because there's more than OpenShift. There are a lot of PaaS solutions. I look at them as doing that, folding dev and ops together. Specifically, if you look at this diagram, what's interesting about it? Well, the whole thing runs in Kubernetes. It relies on Docker to actually containerize your applications for their runtime environment. It does support the standard things you need to persistent storage. The things that I think are important to know about, a couple of key terms, because they may come up a bit later in my little chat here. Projects, templates. A project in the OpenShift sense is really a namespace. It's a namespace for a set of applications you're going to run on a given OpenShift instance, right? Any flavor of OpenShift, by the way. Pretty much everything I talk about today, there may be a little OpenShift enterprise stuff, but pretty much everything I talk about today will work for any flavor of OpenShift, from origin to, to online and enterprise, et cetera. So a project is kind of a namespace, and I'll show you a project in a few minutes. But a project is can host one or more applications and the services that power those applications. A template is kind of a cool thing. Most of the things you see on the screen are the PaaS layer on top of Kubernetes, with the exception of pods, maybe, and services. But anyway, a template is Red Hat's way via OpenShift to more easily allow you to create an app and run it. So what they've done is they've said, hey, it's almost like a click start, or, it's an easy way to say, hey, I'm just going to build a little microservice. And they'll give you maybe a JBoss EAP template where all you do is feed the template your GitHub source location, right, to more quickly create a project. It's really easy to get up and going with a template, and that's sort of the point of those. The template is about the developer's experience. So a developer may use a template to actually create the app. An application then is sort of like the first level object within a project. So an application is made up of a number of services and routes and builds and deployment configs and all these other things that I won't necessarily dive into the utmost detail, but I can show you, that I may show you some things. A service is actually really interesting. A service is actually If you look back at this picture for just a moment, a service is really a unique, no, service is the word I want to use, a unique utility or tool or application that you've written that can run across one or more pods. And what's important about that is that's how you scale. And let's say you're writing a microservice, right? Let's say you work at a bank and you're writing an API for depositing checks, right? Remote deposit capture. You will likely run more than one instance of that in production. And the way that OpenShift deals with that is it says, all right, we'll call that a service. And services can run across one or more pods and nodes in the OpenShift architecture. What's nice about that is then you put what's called a route on top of your service to, it's essentially a load balancer, right? And this is how you get sort of that, elastic scalability. The experience of using routes, I've done this a lot of ways, guys, myself, with other PaaS tools, with lots of other technologies. The experience of using routes in OpenShift, can I go so far as to say it's a joy? It's actually pleasant. It's just a well thought out layer to route traffic to your underlying services. So when you first add a service, you may not add any routes at all, and then essentially a service allows you to layer a proxy on top of that and poke whatever holes you need to get to your service. A pod, as we mentioned, is sort of, if you're familiar with Docker, a pod you could consider sort of a Docker host. So a given pod can run one or more instances of services via Docker containers at runtime, right? That's where, and that's really a raw Kubernetes construct. Image streams are really interesting. Image streams are essentially a Docker registry. Again, that's what I like about OpenShift. If you know Kubernetes and you know Docker, it's pretty easy to figure some of these things out. So an image stream, I'll show you some examples of that in just a minute, but an image stream, just think of it as a private Docker registry. So each project within OpenShift gets its own image stream. The last one is actually called a deployment config. The word was too long, so I just wrote deployment. But a deployment config in the OpenShift sense is, it's essentially, it's a first-class object in their CLI. It belongs to an application. So a given project has a number of what are called deployment configs to deploy your application. Kind of makes sense. It's called a deployment config. But a deployment config really says, hey, this is how you get my application into a running pod, right? And then maybe add these routes while you're doing it. The other thing about deployment configs is they're hookable. So you can trigger a deployment to happen. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of like start to socialize these terms, get them in your head, because they may come up a bit later in the talk when I start showing you some software. So examples. So as I mentioned, OpenShift v3 in particular has a really nice CLI. Here are just a few examples of using the CLI. Okay, OC login. You can imagine what that does. OC new project. So I told you a project is essentially a first-class namespace. It's where you're going to do things. As I can tell from having read a bunch of Red Hat documentation about it, I also believe that projects should be used to sort of isolate your deployment environment, right? So you may have, you see I created one called mobile development. You could expect a mobile test and a mobile production. The stuff I've seen from Red Hat's teams suggests running it that way. There are other ways to accomplish that, multiple OpenShift servers, et cetera, but that's the model I'll use for my little talk today. So in this case, I log in. You can log in with either OAuth token or usernames and credentials. You're going to point at your API endpoint from OpenShift. You're going to create a new project. You're going to select that project. So again, a given OpenShift server very likely runs multiple projects. This essentially selects that as your active project. From here, all I really did was say OC new app, and that will actually work. That will go off and create a new application from the source code sitting at this GitHub URL. This is real, by the way. I think if you pull that software, that should do something. Will likely work. And then one other point I noted a couple times about Kubernetes as the underlying container, I should say container orchestrator. You can really easily scale your applications once you get them out there in OpenShift. So again, that's one of the sweet spots of this technology. It's not just about, oh, look, a developer can type some commands and get software out there. You can actually run it. It's a robust runtime, and there are sort of administrator or operator tool sets that go into that. So in this case, you can see I'm saying, hey, spin up 4 replicas of this. That's a deployment config, I believe. is how you scale. So one other highlight, if you can't figure it out, again, the CLI is good. OC help will tell you everything that's out there. Like I said, I'm a longtime REST API kind of nerd, so I actually like the way the CLI works because most of the endpoints support JSON, which means it's pretty scriptable. And I can also do things like describe endpoints. Again, that's just how my brain is wired to think. So you can say OC describe, and it will say, what do you want to describe? And then you can describe the various endpoints of the OpenShift's APIs, which again, I think makes it fairly scriptable. It also has a robust web console. This is a gotta have, right? For any company who does this stuff, you need some sort of web console. They bill it as geared for operators. In this case, just really quickly, you can see my project, right? Everything in OpenShift gets a label, by the way, which is a really nice way to sort of, hey, show me all of the objects in OpenShift associated with this one, let's say that check deposit API, right? So you could filter by, an API, a label called deposit, for example. So we are looking at an OpenShift enterprise instance. Here is my project called mobile development. I could have created it via the script you just saw, right? We are seeing that my mobile development project has an application, which is really this whole thing we're looking at, with a service, right, that has a route with these ports exposed, right, that's running on the following pod or pods within Kubernetes, again, which are just Docker images under the covers. If I want to, I can come and poke that little up arrow right there and immediately scale up my application. We could get into a debate about whether you'd want to do that manually or via scripting or what have you, but it's nice that you can do it. And I also think it gives you a lot of visibility into what's happening, with your application. So I'll show you this shortly, so I'm not going to try to explain the whole thing for now. But yeah, and so then you can see, you can select my other projects. So for the example I'll show you guys today, I have 3 separate projects, essentially mobile development, test, and production. So that's a brief overview of OpenShift. How about Jenkins? So show of hands of Jenkins users in the room? Yeah, good. Yeah, all right, so I'm just going to skip this whole section. Now, why do people love Jenkins so much? So everybody raised their hand they use Jenkins. Not as many people are using OpenShift. Why? It is very easy to start using Jenkins. It's been around. The Jenkins code base is 5-ish years old. It was Hudson before that, so that's maybe another 5. It's really popular. And I think one of the reasons Jenkins is so popular is that it's really easy to use. I read a funny blog article the other day that called Jenkins the first microservice. I'm like, hey, that's twisted the truth a little bit. Okay, I work at the Jenkins company, and now you're just twisting the truth. But okay, I get it. And it's kind of true. I mean, Jenkins has been a little executable jar file for a long time. Java jar, Jenkins war, and it's running. It's a really slick way to get up and going. I think that has to do with why it's so widely adopted. But it also, it's scalable. So Jenkins, in its very nature, has this thing called distributed builds, right? So a given Jenkins master can run builds for iOS or Linux or Windows by using what's called an agent. So again, I think the fact that it's so easy to get going, but also can scale from there, I think is a pretty big thing, and sort of a testament to why it's gotten so big. If you haven't seen it, small shout out for Jenkins 2.0. Jenkins 2.0 has sort of even further enhanced that getting started experience. So with Jenkins 2.0, you can fairly seamlessly install a recommended set of plugins from the community. So one of the things that used to be a little painful is you sort of had to be smart to know. There's about 1,100 plugins in the Jenkins open source community. There are about maybe another 100 or so in CloudBees offering, which are enterprise proprietary plugins or closed source plugins. You sort of had to know your way around. Jenkins 2.0 makes that a lot easier. Our enterprise offering has always done that. We've always sort of shipped what we thought made the most sense for customers. But Jenkins 2.0 has given sort of a new spin on that, which I think is pretty cool. Similarly, it's a UI refresh. So Jenkins 2.0 is the first step in a journey we're making, for the Jenkins project to enhance the user experience. And I think it's pretty slick. It's just a little bit easier to understand, a little bit easier UX. Speaking of popularity, yeah, by all metrics, Jenkins popularity is huge right now. There are something like 130,000 running instances of Jenkins on Earth, but those are just the ones that can report statistics back to the community, right? So that means they're unrestricted by firewalls, and they left the setting on. I don't know if you guys leave the setting on. You probably turned yours off, but yeah. So that's just the ones we know about. I always guess, when people ask me, it could be twice that. I don't know. It could be quite a bit larger than that. I'm not quite sure, but it doesn't matter much. The answer is it's a lot. A lot of people use it. But it's a busy space. There's a lot of vendors popping up around DevOps right now. I think I gave a talk earlier. I talked about Barnes & Noble and how Barnes & Noble is starting to serve beer. Did you guys know that? Okay. Why? Why are they serving beer? Because nobody buys books in the store anymore. So if you don't kind of grok that like everything's changing around us, we're out here, especially out here in the Bay Area. I think it's going to be tough to figure out, right? So it's very obvious that the companies that are doing really well and like the Netflix of the world and the Amazons of the world are automating what they do, and a lot of them choose to use Jenkins to do that. Which, again, it's just a cool project to be a part of. So where does CloudBees fit into the mix? How many people had heard of CloudBees before this talk? Did I already ask that? Wow, more than I thought. That's right. So I love this picture. I think it just makes it simple. CloudBees is Jenkins for the enterprise. Red Hat is to JBoss or Linux as CloudBees is to Jenkins. We focus on this project. It's really what we do. But we're a part of the community. So, we're an open core company. We contribute a significant amount of our manpower and engineering time to the community. But we also offer a platform meant for companies who run Jenkins at scale. And that platform does include some proprietary functionality, some enterprise features available to our customers. So that's just a brief sort of overview of what we do. I'll be showing you Jenkins Enterprise today. Jenkins Enterprise is one component of our platform. You can think of it as a drop-in replacement for Jenkins Core. Essentially, I call it Jenkins++ sometimes. It's Jenkins plus some additional proprietary features. So where do we go from there? So CloudBees and OpenShift, they're better together. Jenkins and OpenShift. OpenShift has some very basic build facilities built in. When you look at the API, you'll see a build. I'll show you one in a minute, I think. But the builds built into OpenShift are, I think, they're intentionally trivial. In other words, I think the only reason they're there is to give developers the feel that you can get up and going quickly. But I truly believe that, and from talking to the Red Hat team, I really feel that it makes a lot of sense to use Jenkins, and I think their customers are knocking down the door. If you look at the charts I just showed you a minute ago, not only to just leverage the investment they have in Jenkins because they have it and because they're using it, but also because it just makes sense. There are 1,100 plugins out in the Jenkins community for integrating these DevOps pipelines together, and the build facilities built into OpenShift v3 don't have that luxury, right? So what I'm going to show you guys today is almost like a reference architecture for, okay, you're telling me I should use these together. Show me how. So that's what I'll show you in a minute. So there's really two use cases, right? So when we talk about reference architecture, I want to set the stage to tell you what I'm going to talk about, what I'm not. There's really two high-level ways to use these technologies together. The first use case is to use OpenShift as an elastic runtime for Jenkins, right? OpenShift runs on top of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a Docker container orchestrator cluster manager technology. One thing you could do is run Jenkins within that. That's pretty nice, right? You can ephemerally spin up a Docker container to run your build. You can trash it at the end and throw it away, right? Makes total sense. The other use case, though, is about using Jenkins, right, Jenkins Enterprise, as a deployment engine for OpenShift apps. Do those distinctions make sense to everybody? There's really two things. You can talk about running Jenkins within OpenShift, or you can talk about using Jenkins to deploy to OpenShift. Or, of course, you can get your chocolate and your peanut butter or whatever. You can do both. And certainly customers, this is where things are heading. We are working closely with Red Hat to make this a very easy thing to do. More to come on that soon. The point of my talk today is mostly about the second use case. It's about using Jenkins to deploy to OpenShift. I'm not going to go into the innards of how you might choose to run Jenkins within OpenShift. This talk is more about a reference architecture for deploying to OpenShift from Jenkins, regardless of where you run Jenkins. So the cornerstone of that reference architecture is Jenkins Pipeline. So I think I only saw a couple of people raise their hands earlier when I asked about this, but People have been building pipelines for Jenkins for a very long time. I'm sure of that because I was doing it a long time ago. But eventually, there's 1,200 plugins in the community. It started to become a little hard to just build a pipeline. It took, I got to grab this open source plugin, and I got to grab this open source plugin. It was great because that's what open source can do sometimes, right? It's very innovative. But it felt a little painful. It felt like a little too much work. So CloudBees and the community, like as a part of the community, CloudBees sort of stepped up and said, hey, we need a new first-class way to build DevOps pipelines in Jenkins. It should be easier. It should be scriptable. And it needs to be a first-class citizen. This can't be a bolt-on anymore. And that's really what Jenkins Pipeline and the Pipeline suite of plugins really is about. So Pipeline is a new job type. When you install it on Jenkins, you'll see, you might not select a Freestyle or Maven project anymore. You'll go and create a pipeline. And you can even read it, orchestrates long-running activities, yada, yada, as part of a pipeline. What's nice about pipelines is they're concise, and I'm going to show you an example or two in just a minute. And I'm going to leave some behind with you, by the way. They're all out on GitHub, so you can check them out. They're intentionally long-running. What I mean by that is a pipeline can be paused waiting for input for days, for weeks if you wanted to. But also, the long-running nature of a pipeline is not just about being paused and waiting for some QA guy to approve a deployment. It also is designed to run long-running tests, right? For example, a suite of Selenium tests for functionally testing a web application. Or let's say load tests. Let's say you're a JMeter shop, or maybe you use a heavyweight thing like LoadRunner or whatever. There are some very core fundamental things about Jenkins pipelines that make them better at running long-running jobs. For example, if you need to restart Jenkins while a pipeline is paused, you can do that. If Jenkins, if you upgrade a plugin and need to restart Jenkins while you're running a suite of 8-hour load tests, you can do that, right? So there's some sort of very important aspects of the core job technology that as a longtime Jenkins user, I happen to think are pretty cool because they just make it much less of a headache to really use this thing at scale. And that's what I mean by durable here. They're also flexible and extensible. So by flexible, I mean pipelines are a Groovy-based DSL. They're a domain-specific language that sort of bring the power of Jenkins to a simple scripted language that I'll show you in just a minute. But it's also just Groovy code. So just kind of like Gradle, right? You can do more once you're there. So from the flexibility perspective, flow control to your heart's content. Now I'm a keep it simple guy, Kiss. I'm a keep it simple stupid guy. Obviously the goal is to keep these things simple, but we feel confident that Jenkins Pipeline can support the complexity. And by the way, I have the luxury of getting pulled into very many of the toughest customer situations, and I've seen some pretty hairy pipelines. That I can assure you they can get pretty complex in terms of their flow control. And then the extensibility is the most important part, I think, for today's talk, because that's what I'm going to talk about. CloudBees and Red Hat are working together to extend pipeline to OpenShift so that the OpenShift sort of experience is a native part of Jenkins Pipeline. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a minute. And by the way, it comes with a pretty nice visualization component. I'll show you this today, so I won't go into it now. But there you go. So there's the Jenkins Pipeline. Wow, that's pretty easy. For the developers in the room, which I assume is a lot of us, a lot of engineers in the room, that's a pretty simple Jenkins pipeline. So it defines 2 stages, build and test. If you look back at my diagram here, these columns are stages. So I'm defining 2 stages, build, stage, test. I'm acquiring a node, which leverages that thing I told you about Jenkins earlier, the distributed builds. So by saying node, that's a way in pipeline of saying, hey, rather than doing this work immediately on the Jenkins server itself, go fetch another computer to do the work, right? That computer can be a MacBook sitting at your desk. That computer can be a Docker container spun up on a pod on Kubernetes, right? That computer can be out on EC2 or whatever. It then says, hey, check out an SCM. Interestingly, this SCM keyword would mean, I'll show you in a second, the same place where it found the Jenkins file, which is the script you're looking at. It then says, hey, define a tool, go fetch a tool called Maven 3.3. Look for a tool called Maven 3.3, then run a Maven clean install. Again, for the developer folks in the room, that should make a lot of sense. And then stash the source code, excluding this directory called target. It then jumps to a new stage. It says unstash my source and run a Maven verify. So hopefully that's concise and you get it. It's simple. Stash is a really elegant way to prevent checking the same code out again and again. And for the Git users in the room, it should feel relatively familiar. You're shaking heads. It's just an easier way to deal with checking out source across nodes. So what's really nice about that is, I'll show you shortly, Jenkins pipelines can do things in parallel. And if you can just unstash source, you can actually really quickly speed up your builds by running things in parallel. So there's a simple example. This is the Git URL I think I flashed on the screen earlier. What's nice about it is a Jenkins file just sits in the root of your source code. So rather than having to go click a bunch of buttons in Jenkins and figure out all the right places to do all the right things, with Jenkins pipelines, you can just check in a file called Jenkins file that contains some groovy DSL steps in it. And so from that perspective, it's infrastructure as code. It's build as code for Jenkins, which I personally think just makes a ton of sense, right? So the definition of how to build my software sits alongside my software itself. The same way, I think this is a Maven app, right? Yeah, so the same way the dependencies my software needs, right? Or maybe even the documentation for my software, what have you, right? So personally, I just think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things you can do from there that's even further advanced is this concept called pipeline as code. So because we've sort of got a way to check these into your source repo, they have a standardized name, you can actually scan for them, right? So in this example, we have some Git organization level thing, right? And with Jenkins Enterprise, you can actually go out and scan and automatically create the Jenkins stuff. You don't even necessarily have to go job by job anymore with Jenkins. You can just say, hey, Jenkins, this supports GitHub and GitHub Enterprise, as well as Bitbucket. So all you have to do is point Jenkins at your GitHub, and it automatically scans things in, which, again, from an adoption perspective, I think just plumb makes sense. I don't want to have developers clicking around and doing mumbo jumbo just to start to automate their world. I'm not going to go further into pipeline than what I've showed you, other than like some OpenShift specific examples. I will do a small shout out to, we have a ref card out there that is a pretty good syntax card for this. So if you want to, just know more about the basics of doing Jenkins pipeline things, that's out there. I recommend you check that out. So that's Jenkins. So, I did a little bit of Jenkins. I did a little bit of OpenShift. Well, how do you use them together? So, what does it look like to actually start doing these things together? Big, scary picture. Here's what we're going to look at, guys. So this is a high-level picture that shows, in my opinion, sort of like the reference, the way you want to integrate these technologies together. On the left side here, you essentially have Jenkins. This is really a Jenkins file. So imagine that this is the definition of my pipeline. Here is my OpenShift stack. As I said, what you'll have is 3 separate projects in OpenShift, one for development, one for test, and one for production. And then within my Jenkins file, I'll have several stages: build, test, and deploy. I'll have a few others in the stuff I'll show you, just to kind of further the example a bit. But that's the rough layout. So essentially in this flow, what happens is you have a developer who pushes some code to Git, right? Git pokes Jenkins and says, hey, Jenkins, there's been some code committed to the following repository. On the Jenkins side, we have a pipeline that is pointing at that source code location that kicks off a build. The most basic build is just going to do whatever you need to do. And this is where using Jenkins and OpenShift gets really interesting. Jenkins is a really configurable way to validate your software before deploying it. Now, what do I mean by validate? I don't know. What do you mean by validate, right? That's the thing. I've not talked to a company yet who had the exact same validation strategy for their software. Everybody does this a little different, but I've come to the conclusion that they all do 3 things: build, test, and a deployment. Now, a deployment can mean different things to different people. A release, a build, test, and a release, right? But so this is just a contrived example. Again, my experience, I was doing mobile APIs for a big bank. So I typically go to that example. I've got a mobile team. It's got APIs because I think it's relatable. But yeah, so what I'm going to show you is the right way in OpenShift, the right CLI to call things, leveraging their built-in registry technology and tags to do your deployments. And then also some pretty cool things about Jenkins pipelines, both the basics of creating stages and running tests, but also things like manual approvals and then the integration with OpenShift. So Live demo. What could go wrong? Let's give it a whirl. See how the screen behaves here. I like that image for a live demo because it's sort of like this is either going to be great or it's going to not end well for someone. You guys will have to tell me if you can see the screen okay. How does that look? Everyone can see? Okay. So I have just a simple terminal window up. I have the OpenShift command line interface installed on this machine. Literally, that's all I really had to do. The only other thing I did was I logged in. So I logged in as one of my users. That's easy enough to do and see who I am. I think it's a who am I. Yeah, so you can see. By the way, that's me. I told you I was a Pemberton everywhere. If I jump over to the web console, here we are. So we have a couple of different projects out here. You can ignore all of these except for dev, test, and prod for this mobile team thing. But the important part is they're empty. There's not a whole lot going on with them right now. So yeah, all of these are empty. Interestingly, you can see this whole add to project bit. I'm going to show you guys this because I think we have a lot of novice OpenShift folks in the room. I'll just show you really quickly. This is where those templates come into play. So remember I talked to you about image streams versus templates. An image would be a Docker image that you want to wrap your software in. For example, a JBoss, EAP or Tomcat image. A template, however, is sort of a quick start way to do that with some out-of-the-box parameters that then just leverages one of those Docker images anyway. I'm not going to add anything to my project because that's what I've automated. So in this example, this is the same software, the same repo I showed you guys earlier, the exact same little Jenkins file and all. In this example, these are just some parameters for the build. You'll see those in just one sec. But essentially, it really is that easy. So that's my build stage. It gets a node. It checks out SCM. SCM is a special variable. I'll show you how it gets defined in a second. I'm going to make that a little bigger. It then literally just runs a Maven skip test clean and package. You guys all know what skip test does, right? That doesn't sound good in a DevOps talk. I put that there on purpose to show you the very most basic thing you might want to do in this type of flow is just make sure the software compiles, right? Don't run any tests yet. Just make sure the darn thing compiles. Interestingly, that's what the built-in stuff in OpenShift does. As of right now, the default builder for an OpenShift app, it skips tests altogether. So it sort of doesn't solve this problem. It's very lightweight intentionally, and that's what I meant by that earlier. But let's look at it. So here's my pipeline in Jenkins. If I go to configure, you'll see I have some parameters. But the important part is here, pipeline script from SCM. I tell it to grab that from a Git server. And I'm literally just pointing at that same exact Git repo, right? And all I do is say, it's got a branch, that doesn't matter. It says script path, Jenkins file. And these are all defaults, by the way. So what's really nice about that is that's the whole definition of my job. There's no more Jenkins job definition than that. It's really straightforward. If I go off and run this, so fingers crossed, let's make sure we have internet and stuff. I've parameterized this. I did this intentionally just to show it to you guys, to make it easier to see. The parameters are essentially saying, hey, tell me where your OpenShift v3 API server is. These are credentials. So OpenShift has and again, I think this is slick. If you've run this stuff, if you've run real apps and APIs in production, this is just nice to have solved for you. It leverages some core stuff in Kubernetes for service accounts. It also adds some almost policies and access control on top of that that I think is pretty slick. So check out how OpenShift does service accounts. I think it's pretty well designed. In this example, you see I'm just giving it credentials to a development service account, a test service account, and a production service account. Finally, just to really hammer the point home, I'm going to call some Selenium tests, specifically Sauce Labs. Show of hands, have you guys seen Sauce Labs before? Wow, nobody. Cool. Well, I'll do those guys a favor and explain what their tool does. It's a hosted Selenium service. So if you're not familiar with Selenium, it's a functional testing tool. And so Sauce Labs just has a way to host that out there. But let's give it a whirl. Let's kick off a build. Fingers crossed for a hearty and stable internet connection today. So the first step of my build process really just runs a build. So that was really quick. All that really did is go and check out the software. Interestingly, to walk over here, now's when things start to get interesting. I see it says stage, unit, and quality. What's happening here is Jenkins is actually doing some things in parallel on 2 separate computers. It's saying, hey, this guy apparently wants to run, I'm just running Maven tests. So that'll just run the Maven Surefire plugin to run my unit tests. And then I say Maven Sonar. You guys Sonar users in the room? Anybody? Yeah. It's going to, in parallel, go off and kick off a Sonar software quality analysis, which is pretty smooth, so it's done with that. It's now on to deploying to development. So let's really quickly look at what that's going to do. That's where things start to get interesting, and this is where I start to tap into the OpenShift command line interface. What that's doing is it's leveraging a capability we've been building with Red Hat, this line here that I'll come back to. It then is just running the same types of commands I showed you guys earlier. It's going to say new app. It's going to expose a service the first time through. Let's go see what's happening. Hey, cool. That wasn't there before. So what's happening is Jenkins is actually automating the creation of the app within my project. In my example, I'm using one of their built-in Docker images I showed you just a couple minutes ago. This is going off and doing things. This will be fun to see how long this takes today. Yeah, this could take a while. There you go. It's Maven. It has to download the internet. There are ways to solve that problem I won't get into right now. So yeah, we'll give it a few minutes to do Maven-y things. But essentially what that's going to do is rebuild my app from source. Now, for the Jenkins users in the room, that's actually a little weird because the whole point of Jenkins is to take source code and build binaries and deploy them and whatnot. Today, OpenShift doesn't have the best, in my opinion, it doesn't have the best way to deal with, I think, the more common flow of using a Nexus or an Artifactory, right, and using something like Jenkins to build a binary and putting it there. They've just launched, and I believe it was 3.2, they've launched a new build from binary kind of tool. I'm really excited to check that out. I haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but I think that's more of the flow you'd expect. For those who haven't heard of it, there's a piece of OpenShift of this whole flow called source to image. What source to image does is the whole point of it is you feed it source code, it spits out Docker image. We could have a whole debate about whether, here, let me show you this picture. We could have a whole long debate about whether that was the right flow for this architecture. But what they're trying to do essentially, and I think it's a reasonable thing for a big company, they're sort of in that recommended flow, separating the work of doing Docker and Docker image creation. For example, picking a source operating system, right? They're separating that work from the developers. And that's sort of, it appears to me that's sort of their proposed flow, and I think that's reasonable. For a big enough enterprise, if you have a 5,000 software developer company, a 40,000 person company, do you want every developer to just pick what operating system stuff runs on in production? Yes, no, exactly. That would be a nightmare. So that's sort of the flow they're recommending. So because of that, I wanted to show you guys that. That's why I left that in there. I could have simply pumped a Docker image out of my Jenkins build up front. Jenkins is really good at building Docker images. We have a lot of really robust capabilities to do that, but for now, just to keep it simple and also to show you the Red Hat way, I wanted to show you source to image creation. And that's really what you're seeing here in the background. Eventually, there you go. Eventually, you will see, this is the OpenShift console. At the end of this, it's completed what's called source to image, and it's saying, hey, I built your software the way you asked me to, and I've now pushed it to this image stream. That's nice. The output of giving OpenShift my source code is a Docker image, which should look just like this picture to you guys. So really, this is what I did. I ran a very simple set of Maven tests. I then kicked off a new app and published an image to a Docker registry, right? Okay, so what the pipeline does, it completes that step. Jenkins Pipelines have a really slick way to do things like waiting. You see this? What's really nice about that is I've got a really slick way to wait for that to happen and wait for that to finish. So with Jenkins Pipelines, you can just say, hey, wait until this thing completes and time out after 5 minutes. I wanted to show you guys that because I think the syntax is pretty slick. What's cool about it, too, is that you can see I'm still able to leverage that CLI there. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, wait for this Kubernetes pod with a label. Remember I told you guys everything is labeled? I said, wait for this Kubernetes pod with this label to finish spinning up and to be in running phase. That's slick. It's like a two-liner, right? It's a nice little way to do that. So that's how my pipeline knew to complete the development phase by waiting for that Docker image to be published. Then look what it does. It says, oh, OK, I now have a manual input. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. The unicorns of the world may check in their software and walk away and it goes to production, but 99% of companies I've worked with don't seem to work that way. So Jenkins Pipelines, of course, support a really robust mechanism for flow control, including manual or automated approvals. In this example, just to make it simple for you guys, I'll show you a manual approval. It will basically be me going off to poke this button. Again, fingers crossed. So essentially, we're a good way through. For most companies, what I've shown you now would be a really robust flow. Most companies I've worked with and talked to don't really even automate up through QA. I think a lot of companies are making a lot of progress, but even this would be a pretty cool flow for most companies, being able to automate that far up the stack. I did hopefully finish my deployment, so I'm just going to jump back to the OpenShift console. I'm going to go to the overview. There you go. So did you see that change? So what happened is we now have a running pod of the application, and it has deployed it to our test environment, right, as a service, and it even created a route. And the command line for doing this is really easy. It's OC expose, OC expose mobile API. Let's make sure that works. Hey, yay. Everything is working. The live demo, my wingsuit is going fine so far. So that's it. This is just a little mobile optimized little site, right? It's a fake checking thing. I've got a more robust example I do sometimes that shows actually changing this. I'm not going to do that today, but that's the gist of it. I've deployed this. This is deployed to my dev environment. What's happening now, interestingly, it looks like we're paused again, which is good. So our more robust suite of tests have completed. So that more robust suite, if I recall, oh, no, it's actually paused and waiting for input on whether it wants to deploy to test. So we need to go ahead and do that. Oh, no, actually, it's in the midst of going. I already approved it. There you go. Jenkins is off and doing things. So what's happening now is Jenkins has hopefully deployed. In the UI, remember when I said I'll show you a manual approval? It said proceed or abort. I just clicked proceed. That's all secureable. So yeah, I can see now that it's been deployed to the test environment. So what's very cool about this is if things are working as we expect, ta-da, now our app is running in our test environment, which is where I triggered a series of Sauce Labs tests. Interestingly, it failed. That's actually good. If you haven't seen Sauce Labs, check it out. Yeah, it looks like it has the wrong URL somehow. But it's good to show you that because that's the whole point of this pipeline, right? You want to show that things can fail. So if you haven't seen Sauce Labs, this is their little UI. I think it's pretty slick. What it does is it's a oh, that's not what I wanted. I want to go up to the dashboard. Oh, there you go. Looks like it's rerunning. So Sauce Labs is a functional testing tool. If you didn't see, it actually records the playback. So when you get a failure, you can actually have an embedded link in Jenkins of a video of why your website's not working. I think that's pretty slick. This example, oh, there you go, it passed. Yay, at least one of our tests is passing. There you go. Interestingly, I think there's a timing problem, by the way. I'm not waiting long enough. Yeah, question? That's exactly right. It's just Selenium tests. And Sauce Labs is a hosted service of automated browsers to test with. I'm using Sauce Labs to tell my tests what browsers I want to test with. And Sauce Labs hosts those browsers and records videos of the results, so that you don't have to keep 47 Windows computers around with all the matrix of Internet Explorer junk you want to support. They have a tunneling technology that I can talk to you about after the, yeah, exactly. I know that because I helped them fix it to make it work well with Jenkins. What, another question? Yeah, so that's actually a very good question. I intentionally am not doing like a Maven release prepare, if you're referring to like, the way you would typically do that. No, I'm intentionally not doing that. In this example, what I do is it's actually based on Docker tags. So, see here? I'm actually just using the built-in registries and I'm dynamically switching. Imagine I've just got a current and test and prod tag. It's a contrived example. Typically what I would have done is a Maven deploy instead of a Maven clean install. And I would have published artifacts to a Nexus or Artifactory. Does that make sense? But just to show the point, and actually, so the test deployment did work here. Literally, I want to show you this really quickly. The deployment to test is right here, guys. That's all it takes to deploy to test with OpenShift. I've got a Docker image that I built and published in my first step. I simply grab the latest. Because I've gotten this far, I want to grab the latest and I want to deploy it, re-tag it as test. And then I create a new app from that tag. That's it. So essentially, OpenShift has the ability to do this source to image build and all these cool little tricks, but it also just works well with Docker images. So in this example, my whole test deployment that I actually showed you and at least one of my Selenium tests passed for is a simple Docker image. And what's really cool, it also auto-registers itself for Docker hooks, which means if I re-tag a new image as test in their Docker registry, it'll automatically perform a deployment of that Docker image to the test environment. You can turn that off, of course, but that's sort of their default flow, which I think is pretty snazzy. I have experience using Jenkins Pipelines with pull requests, but not this OpenShift flow, but I'd be happy to chat about it a bit later. Yeah, because there's some really cool things you can do with pipelines and pull requests. Great question. Cool. So hopefully that kind of illustrated the point. Most of that worked. I think we had a small timing issue, which is actually good because it shows you, hey, actually, your Selenium test did not pass. You cannot deploy to production, which I think is pretty slick. So let's jump back over. So all the source code you just saw is out there. Go poke at it. What did you see? Well, this is the little the magic sauce that made a couple pieces of that work. We have this plugin that integrates the OpenShift CLI. The real magic of what it does, it integrates with Jenkins credentials, which means you can securely store your OpenShift service accounts in Jenkins. They will not be admitted to logs. It's well thought out from a security perspective. It also integrates with Jenkins tool API. What I mean by that is this is actually really an important thing to know about Jenkins. Not only does Jenkins support distributed builds, it also has a built-in way to say what software or tools you need on a distributed compute resource to do the build. In this example, what it's doing is you go off and define what version of the OpenShift CLI you want, and when Jenkins gets a node, it automatically installs that CLI on there for you. It's just a nice way to kind of keep control of your environment. If you use Docker, for example, every time you spin up a machine, it's going to be new, right? If you don't have persistent volumes or whatever. So using the tool API, I think, makes a lot of sense. I showed you this already, but this is roughly all that took to get the app deployed to dev. In this case, I'm actually pointing at source code. So I'm saying, hey, just grab the source code you checked out on the Jenkins, what's called the Jenkins Agent, and I want you to wrap it in this image. And that's how we actually spun that thing up in Tomcat 8. So that's one of the inbuilt images. So really, what did that look like? Well, here was the flow. We grabbed source code from GitHub. We called a Maven clean install. We ran a series of JUnit tests, performed a sonar analysis, deployed to our development environment, asked the user for approval, and then deployed to our test environment. We then kicked off a series of Sauce Labs with Selenium, a series of Selenium tests with Sauce Labs, recording them and storing videos. And then we actually didn't do the production deployment, but that's OK. Our pipeline was almost there. But I think that's pretty slick. Yeah, question? In this example, yes. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, and we could talk about how you may want to manage externalized configuration and some other things like that, right? you'd want some other things like service discovery in your real production environment, but we'll talk about that later in terms of like managing properties or config you needed to make it different. But it's a best practice, right? Yep, I create an OpenShift project from a set of source code that has a Maven POM XML in it, which is how OpenShift knows that you're talking about a JEE app. They have these little things called, I think they're called application profiles, so it can automatically detect. So for example, if you're building a PHP app, it knows to look for certain config files for that. And that's how it knows what builder to use out of the box. So a couple of additional resources. We just published this blog yesterday. It sort of walks through the same thing I showed you guys, but in a bit more detail. It's a guest blog over on the OpenShift site, so check that out. There's the URL. Also, you can go out to the CloudBees site as well. We have some pretty decent, actually we have a bunch of integration with Red Hat technologies. We have a cool little site that'll list those out. It's not just OpenShift. I talked about OpenShift today, but we also, we have integration with OpenStack for our private SaaS edition product. JBoss deployments are a cinch with Jenkins, so don't think it's just OpenShift. This just happens to be a focus for us these days. Again, I'm A. Pemberton. I really encourage you guys to check out our Docker-based trial. If you want to check out the CloudBees Jenkins platform, it's cloudbees.com/getstarted. That's probably the easiest way to find CloudBees. I'm also a nerd for ASCII art, so I just like the CloudBees logo and the ASCII art. As I mentioned to you guys earlier, we have 2 editions of our platform, what's called Enterprise Edition. This is sort of our flagship. It's a Jenkins platform. It helps you run Jenkins at scale. So if your company runs Jenkins at all, it has some pretty nice facilities built in for the enterprise. Things like the ability to manage multiple masters. We have an inbuilt analytics capability. So dashboarding of your DevOps data. It's a pretty hot topic right now. We have a built-in way to do that called Jenkins Analytics. We also work on cloud and container support. So as a company, we're really focused on integrations with other leading companies. And then beyond that, we have what's called PSE, or Private SaaS Edition. It runs on, from a private cloud perspective, it runs on Red Hat OpenStack as sort of the preferred mechanism for running it. And it wraps Enterprise Edition in a fully elastic experience. If you want to learn more about it, swing by our booth. And just a small shout out for our event. It's in September. It's called Jenkins World. This year we're doing one mega conference. We did some smaller sessions all over the globe, but we have a big conference out here in Santa Clara in September. So thanks for listening. Any more questions, guys? Had some good ones during the talk. Does anybody have any other questions? Yes, there is a Kubernetes plugin for Jenkins. It's open source. The developer of that plugin, I believe, is a CloudBees guy, my buddy Carlos. I'm pretty sure the lead maintainer of that open source plugin works at CloudBees. We could talk about, there are multiple ways to do dynamic Jenkins agents. In our platform, and particularly in our private SaaS edition, we have a very opinionated way to solve that for you, so you don't have to do as much of the legwork. But yeah, we do support native Kubernetes integration. Any others? One more? Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, could you use Jenkins Pipeline to deploy to JBoss EAP? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the other blog article that we published yesterday was exactly that. Interestingly, it didn't take a whole lot of fancy technology. The EAP has a pretty good CLI that you can actually just integrate with directly. But we just published an article. So if you go out and check this one out, read mine first. You'll see the other one that we published on that topic. Good question. All right, well, I think I'm out of time. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.